Hey folks, this is Kelani. We're in a bit of a tough spot right now, aren't we? I know a lot of people who have left Azeroth behind as they search for a more entertaining outlet, and a whole bunch more are holding on by a thread. If Blizzard released official subscriber numbers, still, I would expect to see quite a significant drop-off after Battle for Azeroth launch. This expansion just doesn't seem capable of holding players' attention all too well. But why is that? Let's have a look at the top 10 reasons players are quitting WoW right now. One of the major factors at play here seems to be class design, or a bit of a lack of meaningful class design choices at any rate. It seems like the majority of classes are simply missing one or two things to feel whole or complete, and it's not really that surprising. Going into Legion, every class was tipped upside down and completely rearranged. Every single class saw massive changes to their kit and how they worked as a package, and for the most part a lot of abilities were pruned again. But it didn't feel too bad in Legion because everything was designed around our artifact weapons. Artifacts filled in most of those gaps, and we picked up our artifact within the first 10 minutes of the Legion expansion, so we practically never had to play without it. Fast forward to the end of Legion when we lost every single trait and talent tied to artifact weapons, and suddenly all of those holes become very apparent once again. Some classes were patched up either by having passives made baseline or even had their artifact ability made baseline, but the holes were still pretty evident. Some classes just didn't flow properly anymore, and they were supposed to get fixed in patch 8.1, but we all know how that turned out. So in the one expansion where they decide not to completely reinvent the wheel for once, when it comes to classes and class design at any rate, they leave everyone feeling incomplete. The classes that feel the best to play right now are the ones which had the less impactful artifact weapons in Legion, or the very few which had the majority of their gameplay holes patched up properly. Either way, it seems like a lot of players just aren't having fun with how their class plays at the moment, and if playing your character isn't fun to begin with, how can you expect to have any fun playing through the content of this expansion? Sadly, that's another reason why players are leaving their characters behind. A lot of the content in Battle for Azeroth just doesn't have a great deal of weight to it. There's actually a pretty decent chunk of stuff to keep you occupied if you really want to play the game, but it feels like the majority of it is very shallow. We're dealing with a wide pool here, but it's only deep enough to get your toes wet. It's pretty easy to see in island expeditions and warfronts especially. The only real reason to step into warfronts on your main character is to get that free loot box once per warfront cycle. Unless you want to gear an all up fairly quickly, there's no real draw or need to run warfronts more than once every few weeks, and even then people treat it as more of a chore than anything else, even though they're getting a pretty decent piece of gear by the end of it. Islands suffer from some of the same problems, but I think the biggest issue there is the timer. Having the entire island a race against the clock creates a one-dimensional piece of content. It's literally just an artifact power grind these days. They even had to change how rewards are calculated and distributed because how it was originally set up was counterproductive. The artifact power grind is a whole other can of worms though. It's pretty frustrating that out of the various pieces that made up the Legion artifact system, the only one they decided to keep was the grinding aspect, and even that feels less impactful this time around. Maybe it's because we've already gone through this process once before, maybe it's the fact that our numbers aren't getting stupidly big like they did in Legion, but the most likely reason why the artifact power grind falls flat in BFA is that we don't really get to unlock anything. We had game-changing passives and abilities in our Legion artifacts. In BFA we get a handful of passives. Hopefully this all changes with the Heart of Azeroth in patch 8.2, but we haven't even seen a glimpse of what the new progression system looks like right now, or what it could even look like to begin with, so I don't blame the chaps who are taking a break until 8.2 comes around specifically. We're not just grinding for artifact power though. With the vast majority of content lacking in depth, it feels like a grind to get through any of it. Getting your weekly done for the island expedition feels pretty grindy. Working your way through any number of warfronts is pretty grindy. Even Mythic Plus feels more grindy this time around. It feels like they tried to cram as many abilities as they could into the trash monsters, and slapping tyrannical or fortified on every single key doesn't really help that much either. Personally, I am having a blast running Mythic Plus dungeons still, especially at the higher end of keys, but it's been really hard getting more guildies into dungeon runs. A lot of people seem to think it's just a huge grind to get your IO score up high enough to even get invited into groups in the first place. And honestly, it kind of is. Many groups won't give you a chance if you don't have a decent IO score, and even though I am having fun in dungeons for the most part, I would say quite a few dungeons do feel very grindy to get through, a lot worse than Legion at any rate. But grinding isn't always the worst thing in the world. It can actually be one of the main reasons to continue playing sometimes, but that relies on something shiny being at the end of that grind. That's where another issue comes into play. There aren't really many long-term goals available for players in Battle for Azeroth. A lot of rewards are simply random, and you just don't have any impact on what you're going to receive. RNG has crept into every crevice of the game, and when all you have to go on is the roll of the dice, it never feels great when you roll snake eyes. Island expeditions are entirely random with how they reward loot. Warfronts are entirely random with how they reward loot. The boxes from the once per cycle quests are entirely random. At the start of the expansion we couldn't obtain higher item level Azeroth armor without being very lucky. That was a huge RNG pitfall, but your Mythic Plus cache is still entirely random. Thankfully we can work towards Azeroth armor in a meaningful way now, but it's probably just too little too late for a lot of people. The only real ways we have to target loot right now is to run Mythic Plus dungeons, which have Azeroth armor removed from their drop tables entirely, and to run raids. Everything else is heavily entwined with our good friend RNG. Pretty much every piece of loot you can obtain also has another level of RNG tacked on top thanks to Warforging and Titan Forging, which means we can't ever really work towards a completed set of best in slot gear anymore either, which removes one of the staple long-term goals entirely. Playing slot machines might be fun while you're winning, but people will get tired of it eventually, and that's what we're seeing with BFA, I think. I guess it doesn't really help that WoW focuses everything into one very specific spot though. Endgame. Right now, Endgame is pretty much the only game for the most part, but it's gone quite a bit worse over the last few expansions. This isn't necessarily just saying the only thing to do is raid either, because the Endgame goalposts keep moving with every patch. Right now it's Uldir, but when the next raid opens up, our endgame will be the Battle of Desert Allure. That shifts everything upward to the point where Uldir isn't even considered content anymore. Item levels are going to shift with Season 2 of BFA, so Mythic Dungeons will reward the same item level gear as Heroic Uldir did, with normal Desert Allure rewarding the same item level as Mythic Uldir. There's literally zero reason to step back into the Titan facility after Season 2 goes live. Some players might think that's a great thing, we can go straight into the new raid without having to do any work beforehand, but that's also severely limiting the scope of our available content at any given time, and that's without even taking the leveling process into consideration. With how leveling worked in BFA, I wouldn't be too surprised if we didn't have to level again in future expansions. Going up levels and getting nothing for it, while actually losing power and abilities and items along the way, is pretty weird and feels very empty. BFA was the first time that it ever really happened, so I wonder where we'll go from here. It's sort of interesting that players dislike Endgame being the only game, but it's that very concept that allows them to take a break so easily and catch up later if they decide to resubscribe. I guess knowing that also makes it far more likely that someone will take a break in the first place though. So we've gone through quite a few reasons why someone might unsub already, and pretty much any one of those could be reason enough by itself, but all of these issues are made 10 times worse when we're not really being kept in the loop. There's been very little communication that we're actually being heard. There's only two real major victories for the community here. The first is the Azeroth armor vendor. It doesn't really fix the problem per se with Azeroth armor, but at least it gives us a long-term goal with actual choices, and we can pick up the Azeroth armor with the traits we want. The second victory would be for whatever this new Heart of Azeroth progression system is going to be, so I guess that's a bit of a half victory at best because we have no idea what it's going to look like yet. The dev team acknowledges that the artifact power grind in BFA isn't really working in its current iteration. Hopefully they come up with something fun and interesting which makes better use of the AP grind, but those are the only two topics which we've had some meaningful discussion about and had sort of, this is our plan going forward, we know we more or less screwed up. The rest has been pretty dark and silent for the most part, without any decent insight into why certain design decisions are being made or what their current goals are with the new features and systems in BFA. We're just wandering through this expansion, hoping they decide to fix at least a few things that are going wrong. A fantastic example of the lack of communication is the recent server lag afflicting a huge number of players. Ever since patch 8.1 went live, a really weird persistent server lag has plagued the game, and it seems to strike at random times and stay there until you relog or restart your game. I had to deal with this server lag for my entire journey from 110 to 120 on my Demon Hunter, and it still hasn't left me alone. It can make for some hilarious moments, but it can also get you killed pretty quickly in the wrong setting. It's also just not very fun to play with lag which is out of your control, but until very recently no one at Blizzard had even acknowledged that there was a problem. All we know right now is that they're looking into it, so I guess we'll see where that goes. For now we're stuck with the lag. It's also not too encouraging that when certain activities in-game aren't all too exciting, yet when the dev team does address a handful of concerns, we're told we're just playing the game the wrong way. If we play it the right way, it's actually fun. That's probably worse than not getting an answer at all, yet every time communication comes up we're promised that it's going to be better next time, we'll do better next time, But until that next time, people will keep leaving the game, and as more people leave the game, it starts to trigger a domino effect. I've said it before, and I'll say it plenty more, I'm sure, but World of Warcraft is always a better experience with friends. It's an MMO after all. Raiding with friends throughout various expansions has given me so many precious memories, and we all know how frustrating it can be to pug pretty much anything. So a well-rounded team of friends and guildies can make the game far more enjoyable. But what happens when those friends or guildies decide to stop playing? I'm actually in this situation right now. My guild just imploded. The holidays hit us pretty hard and we didn't raid for a few weeks, so people started dropping. That's understandable. We'll work our way through it, we always do. But then a few more players decided the game just wasn't worth their time. A handful of others aren't having fun, and the holidays gave them the break they needed to realize that they just aren't having a good time right now, and on it goes. I don't blame people for taking a step away from the game, it's just a game after all, but I also see a lot of players drop out because they don't have anyone left to play with. It can be as simple as that. You can love the game and everything that's happening right now, but if you don't have anyone to share that experience with, it can feel quite hollow. Making new friends in WoW is definitely one option, but I wouldn't be too surprised if even more people ended up leaving the game after turning to pug groups. The social aspect of WoW has been suffering for quite a while. It's not in a particularly great place, and going from a coordinated group of players to whoever happens to join your instance can be a bit jarring. Depending on what you're trying to do, you could come across a wide variety of issues. Trying to join a raid group by yourself isn't usually too bad, but pug groups usually need to reform at least a little bit after every boss, especially if you wipe a few times. I don't know if it's a patience thing, or lack thereof, or if people just don't have the time to spend wiping on a boss over and over, but players don't tend to stick around for very long in pug groups. If you want to hop into higher end Mythic Plus dungeons, you have to tick two very important boxes. You need a decent IO score most of the time, and you need to be playing one of the good classes. I didn't have too many issues getting into groups on my mage, but when people see a Shadow Priest sign up, sometimes I get declined before I can even message the leader. If you're playing a rogue, demon hunter, mage, hunter, or warlock, you'll probably be fine on the DPS side of things in the higher keys. Druid, monk, and priest healers usually get groups fairly easily, and tanks are fairly balanced from what I know of, unless you're a bear. Anyone else will have to make a pretty convincing argument. Shadow priests and DPS shamans still have a pretty bad rap for the most part, and it can be very difficult getting people to even give you a chance some days. So if you're playing either of those classes, you might have more trouble compared to some others, when realistically you should be capable on pretty much any class or spec. The difference between a lot of classes is fairly small these days, but community perception can make it difficult to get anything done on certain characters. The general attitude of players is very hit or miss as well. You could come across some very friendly folks, or you run across people who could teach you a few new words you probably shouldn't repeat. I've seen some very toxic individuals recently, but when you're dealing with pugs, you can't really afford to be too picky. Honestly, I just think it's way better playing with a group of like-minded individuals, no matter what you're trying to accomplish in-game. But if you come from that and go out into the wild world of pugs, I wouldn't be surprised if that pushed you over the edge of unsubscribing. Many players might not be too bothered with the state of the game, how raiding or Mythic Plus dungeons are, or what's coming next. They might just be content seeing the new stuff and calling it a day, but staying attached to this game isn't as simple as some other MMOs out there. There's a subscription fee to think about. WoW costs you cash every month for the privilege of being able to log in whenever you want. If you don't feel like you're getting your money's worth, chances are you're going to cancel that subscription just like any other form of entertainment you pay for. That really is the nail in the coffin for a lot of players looking at leaving the game. Some of the other reasons in this video might have pushed them into thinking they should unsub from WoW, take a break and come back later, or maybe just check back next expansion or forget about the game entirely, but seeing the money disappear every month is the kicker. If they unsub, they can use that money on other games or entertainment. And once you're unsubbed, honestly, it's a lot easier to not be too bothered about being unsubbed. But what I think this is always going to come down to is, are you having fun in World of Warcraft? If the answer is no, you should probably take a bit of a break. The game, your characters, and hopefully your friends and guildies will be there when you get back. Maybe you can drag a few of them back to the game if you think it's worth your time again, but the main reason a lot of people have been unsubscribing lately is simply because they aren't having fun. There are a lot of games out there nowadays, and depending on which itch you're trying to scratch, you can usually find a great game or two that suits your needs. MMOs are actually the one genre that seems to be hurting really bad right now. I've heard great things about Final Fantasy, but haven't given it much time personally. Guild Wars 2 is also apparently doing good things these days, but I haven't checked back with that one in a very long time. Maybe I should give a few of these other games a play around, but that's it for this video. Do you have any other reasons that players might be quitting WoW right now? Have you stopped playing for any specific reason, or do you continue to play for any specific reason? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks. Good luck and have fun, and as always, I will see you next time.